having a high histamine level and allergic reaction can be really, really bad. You know, it's not just that you sneeze a little bit, it can really affect what's going on with your brain. It can, you know, you've got a sore head, your eyes are irritated, your mouth's itchy, etc. So hay fever can be just awful for some people. But yeah, histamine is a really interesting subject. It's actually a massive subject. There's so much to it, and so much more to it than simply, you know, allergic reactions. And it's interesting you're talking about the medical profession, because I think the medical profession often runs several years or sometimes decades behind sort of naturopathic therapists, nutritional therapists, etc. And I think GPs are starting to sit up and look at histamine related problems, whereas we've been looking at it for quite a few years now in our sort of natural practices. But yeah, just to quickly touch on histamine, it is actually, well, it should be a friend. The reason we have histamine releasing cells in our bodies is that when we were running around in the primordial swamps, living out in nature, if we met something nasty, a nasty bug, a nasty bacteria, a parasite, then our bodies would make histamine as a reaction to that. Its job is to flush stuff out. So, you know, your nose runs, your bowels can run with histamine. It's basically there, flush it out, job done, over. And that's what histamine is meant to do. But now we're seeing that instead of it being this friend that's there to protect us, it's actually becoming much more of a foe, where it's actually causing an awful lot of problems. And way beyond just having an allergic reaction to, say, a pollen, we're seeing much more allergies coming in, much more food allergies, people with very broad sort of allergic conditions as well. So it seems to be growing in its momentum with what's happening with histamine nowadays.
Yeah, and there's even something called histamine intolerance, which is a recognized condition now, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when I started in my practice 25 years ago, the only time I thought about histamine was when I was treating something like hay fever, or if I had somebody with asthma and we were trying to dampen down that allergic response. And now I'm sitting in my clinic room saying to people all the time, look, I think you've maybe got histamine intolerance. So have you heard about histamine intolerance? And it's not that it's a faddy condition. It's real, it's there, it's really causing people a lot of problems. And histamine intolerance can be quite complex, and can be quite difficult to spot, because these people are coming in and they're presenting with anxiety, insomnia, maybe irritable bowel syndrome. They might feel dizzy, they're having palpitations, and they have this sense that there's something that they're doing that's making it worse, or something they're eating that's making it worse, but they can't pinpoint it. It's not always the same food that's causing the problem, because it's not a food allergy. It's actually caused by there being too much histamine in the body. So histamine's building up and it's causing this chaotic array of different symptoms.
Yeah, it is quite extraordinary. It's something that I've gone into personally as well over the last few years. It is quite a minefield of different things that could be causing too much histamine to be building up in the body, like aged foods. Histamine builds up in food the longer it's around. So things like cheese and ferments all are high in histamine. So tell us a little bit about some of the things which we might be lacking, which might lead us to having too much histamine in the system.
Well, you mentioned DAO there. It's diamine oxidase, and that's an enzyme that we have in our bowel that helps to break down histamine. So true histamine intolerance is caused by a lack of that enzyme. And you can go and get a test done. It's a salivary test that you can do, I think. Am I right on that? Maybe it's a finger prick blood test. I know that you can do it, and it's quite a straightforward test to do. So that you can order them up online. So you could probably just Google it and find out about who does a DAO test. If you are lacking DAO, this diamine oxidase, you can't break down histamine. And if you take a supplement of DAO, that's the problem sorted. So it's fairly straightforward. I have to say, I have tested a number of people and not one of them has had DAO deficiency, and it's usually something else that's going on.
Yeah.
But there are lots of reasons why somebody might end up with a histamine problem. A lot of it is, I think, stems from digestive dysfunction. We have a lot of histamine releasing mast cells in our digestive system. And if you have gut dysbiosis, so if you've got a bacterial imbalance going on in your gut, it can cause excessive histamine symptoms. If you have something called SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, that can trigger a histamine response because you've got bacteria overgrowing there. So your immune system kicks in to try and handle getting rid of that bacteria. It can also be caused by nutritional deficiency. So if you're lacking, say, zinc, then you can sometimes have a problem with excess histamine. If you have hormonal problems, then it can influence histamine levels as well. And I came about that, particularly the hormonal side, tied into a particular client I was working with who came to see me for food allergies and hope she was allergic to nightshades and very histamine reactions with skin rashes. And we spotted the food issues. And then she said, can you treat my PMT? And I treated her PMT and sorted out what was an estrogen imbalance. And she came back and she said, since you sorted out my PMT, my allergies have all gone away. And I thought, all right, okay, there's a connection here. So somebody that's estrogen dominant can become a lot more histamine. Progesterone tends to have the opposite effect. Progesterone is the hormone of pregnancy. When we're pregnant, we've got foreign genetic material in our bodies. We don't want our histamine levels to be soaring. We want our histamine to be dampened down because we don't want that immune system trying to get rid of that foreign material. So basically progesterone and getting that imbalance can calm down histamine as well.
How do you drill down and spot what is actually causing this overload of histamine? It's really hard, isn't it?
It's a massive subject. And, I feel like I understand it so much more now. I'd say probably the past 3 or 4 years, it's really come into the foreground for me in practice. And it's really joining up an awful lot of dots. And it makes a lot of sense. To me, histamine feels like a bit of a missing link in a lot of the conditions that I've been trying to manage in clinic. It's to dig down, you really have to go into somebody's medical history. You have to go right back and have a look at what's going on now, but what's happened in the past. When somebody was born, did they have lots of antibiotics? Or, was it a difficult birth even? If you were born by cesarean section, then you're not going to get that first introduction of the right bacteria at that stage, and we're going to potentially have a lifelong gut bacterial imbalance. Have you had childhood antibiotics? Do we have a family tendency for histamine problems? We're now understanding that methylation, which is all about energy release or energy production in the cells of the body, is tied into histamine issues as well. And we now know, because of all the scientific research and our understanding of things at sort of cellular level, that if somebody is undermethylating, which can be a genetic thing, it can be caused by a SNP on a gene for folic acid metabolism, that can then increase histamine as well. So we have to dig really deep, do a really complex medical history and start looking at where all the dots are, all the things are that we need to join up together. And usually it's like most things, JJ, it's the perfect storm. You'll often find there's several things in there, not just one. Most of these problems are multifactorial in their origins.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really does need that holistic approach, looking at the whole to work out what the causes are and how to sort them out.
Mm-hmm.
There are ways to deal with an overloaded system in terms of histamine anyway. There are herbs that we can take, there are certain things that we can do.
Okay, well, the first thing is, if you think that you have an issue with excess histamine, probably quite a good starting place would actually be to look online at histamine intolerance, because you can get questionnaires and you can go down them and go tick box, tick box, tick box, tick box, that's me. So if you are ticking all the boxes for histamine, then what you want to be thinking about is trying to increase your what I call your histamine bucket. A very simple way to think about this is that if you are histamine intolerant, you don't have much capacity to hold histamine. I'm completely non-allergic. I've got a huge histamine bucket. I could, eat histamine foods till the cows come home, and I'm not going to have any reactions. I don't have any allergies, etc. Other people can be really, really high histamine. They've basically got a tiny little histamine bucket. So what we have to do is we have to stop filling that bucket up. So that is cutting back on histamine foods. And we need to increase the size of that bucket so that you can actually increase that histamine capacity. Now, the food thing's interesting because people will often come into clinic and they'll say, look, I feel like something's triggering this off. I feel like I'm reacting to a food, but they can't pinpoint the specific food. And that's because it's a different thing that fills the bucket each time. It's whatever it was that came to the top of the bucket that causes the symptom. Because they say, yeah, well, one time I thought that tomatoes made me upset, and well, another time I thought it was those nuts that I ate. And when I ate the tomatoes, I was fine. And it is a real head scratcher, because that's a good clue for somebody to look at histamine. It's like, I know I've got food intolerance, but I can't pinpoint it. It changes all the time. It's usually histamine that's at the back of that. So cutting down the amount of histamine foods that you're eating will give you a bit of a rest from the symptom. And then making that bucket bigger is doing things like taking antihistamine remedies. And I don't mean just taking an antihistamine from the pharmacy. I think probably using herbal remedies and natural remedies is going to be much more restorative. Working on your gut bacteria. Unfortunately, this is a case where using fermented foods is not good. So, usually I'll be saying to people, look, get some ferments in there, get some kombucha in there, some kimchi, etc. But fermented foods can sometimes push histamine levels up. So taking probiotic foods can make a huge difference, or probiotic supplements. And again, you have to be really careful, because some probiotic strains can increase histamine. So there are some probiotics that have got fermentate in their name. They're probably not the ones that you want to go with. And the one that I find works really particularly well is Lactobacillus rhamnosus. And I will often recommend that as a single strain probiotic for people. Getting your zinc status sorted out can make a huge difference. And you can buy zinc tally tests. So it's a zinc solution that you can do a taste test with to determine whether you're zinc deficient. And then getting on top of stress levels can make a huge difference as well. So trying to really calm down your adrenal reactions, because that can make you a bit more pro-inflammatory. So those sort of things can actually increase your histamine bucket. The other thing is actually addressing small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So if you have bloated bowels, gassy bowels, your bowels are really unsettled, and it feels almost like you've got a candida overgrowth, it might actually be a bacterial overgrowth rather than a yeast overgrowth. And taking some antibacterials can make a difference. So black seed oil, oregano oil. I had one woman who came to see me that had terrible histamine problems, and actually oregano oil sorted it out. It was a bacterial overgrowth in her bowel that was at the back of it. So looking at all of those things can make a huge difference.
And I love the idea of making your histamine bucket bigger. It's a great way of explaining it. There are other things that you can take as well. There are natural antihistamines, though, aren't there, that might give you temporary relief?
Yeah. So if you are a forager, or if your income's restricted, there are plants out there that you can go and pick for yourself. So our native nettle is a really good antihistamine. There's also the ribwort plantain, which is a very cooling antihistamine. And plantain is also really good as a connective tissue tonic. So it really tones the mucous membranes. And elderflower is also a really good antihistamine. It's very rich in quercetin, and quercetin is a supplement that you can actually buy in health food stores to calm down histamine responses. But elderflower is a really good natural source for quercetin. So elderflower, plantain, nettle are three plants that you could go and gather from the wild to try and help you. There are a number of medicinal herbs that I prescribe in my practice as well. And probably my number one favourite, and it'll be no surprise here, JJ, because I'm absolutely a total mushroom head, is reishi mushroom, red reishi mushroom. Yay, one of my favourites. And it is just such a good antihistamine, but I feel like what it does is it actually resets the immune system. So it brings you back into more of a centre ground and just pulls you back from that excess histamine. It actually works both ways. It can pull you back from being having a low viral resistance as well. So it normalizes the T1 to T2 immunity. But yeah, great for histamine problems. I remember going to a seminar on medicinal mushrooms, and the person that was delivering it was saying that if you take reishi mushroom for 2 or 3 seasons of hay fever, often the hay fever will go permanently. So it actually completely transforms your reaction to pollens, which is, incredible. So it's a really good antihistamine. It's an immune normalizer, as I say, brings you back from that sort of real histamine push. And, you know, quite a good clue for somebody that's high histamine is they probably don't get that many colds, flus and sniffles. You know, they tend to, their immune system set up into that allergic state. So red reishi mushroom. Another herb that I use a lot as an antihistamine is a herb called coleus, which I find really good for general histamine problems, but particularly skin problems. So problems like rosacea, which is associated with histamine excess. And actually coleus has another really important role to it. It's actually a biofilm buster. We know that bacteria build biofilms up around them, and that stops antibiotics getting into work. So if you were having issues with a bacterial overgrowth that was pushing your histamine, then coleus would be a good remedy to think about. And then we've got the adaptogens. So we've spoken about ashwagandha before on this show. We've spoken about schisandra. Then there's another cooling adaptogen called rehmannia, which if we use it in its raw state is really good at reducing histamine. So using these adaptogenic remedies can make a huge difference as well. And schisandra is interesting because it supports the adrenals, but it also increases histamine clearance out through the liver. Because, you know, we break histamine down in the gut with enzymes and all the right sort of healthy gut flora, but it goes to the liver for processing, and having good liver function is really important for clearing out excess histamine too.
That's really interesting. And then there's another element to this, isn't there? There's inflammation, because all that histamine flying around causes inflammation. So presumably anything that you can take to reduce that inflammation would help too.
Yeah, so using things like turmeric or CBD could be good anti-inflammatories. Nettle could be a good anti-inflammatory in that situation as well. But yeah, any inflammatory condition, it's worth considering whether histamine is a bit of a player with what's going on there. I've got a woman that I work with that's got rheumatoid arthritis, and actually we discovered putting her on a low histamine program really resolved the problem. So if I'm looking at any of these sort of autoimmune spectrum conditions, then I might think about histamine as being a pro-inflammatory mediator. And the other area that I think is really interesting is, you know, we're right in the middle of our COVID pandemic right now. Long COVID is a condition that is associated with inflammation. And a lot of people that are long COVID sufferers are finding that going on a low histamine program is actually improving what's happening. So it's inflammatory. We know that COVID's inflammatory and that there are inflammatory cytokines involved there. So actually reducing histamine down can actually help with your recovery from COVID.
That is fascinating. So actually it has a great part to play in an awful lot of conditions that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, and I think it's something that we're going to understand an awful lot more about. I think the whole COVID side to histamine will actually bring it much more into the focus of orthodox medicine. You know, I'm joining up the dots between Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is hypermobility, mast cell inflammation, endometriosis, histamine. They're all linked together. To me, it's the missing link in an awful lot of what we're dealing with. And conditions, as I say, like rosacea, we've got interstitial cystitis, we've got endometriosis. We're now understanding that a lot of this is about mast cell problems, and mast cells are the histamine releasing cells in our body. So we need to keep them stable, we need to keep them calm, and we'll find that by addressing mast cell problems and histamine problems, we can actually do an awful lot for these chronic inflammatory conditions that are just also in pandemic proportions nowadays, it would seem.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're not wrong there. Certainly, we see so many allergies and intolerances these days, it's untrue, which we never saw when I was a youngster, when I was a girl. Yeah, so the connection with long COVID is quite an eye-opener as well.
Yeah, and we have to look at it for mental health problems. It's, you know, something we don't talk about is the amount of histamine that's inside our brains. It's an excitatory neurotransmitter. You know, it's hissy, it stimulates our brains. So people with mental health problems, ADHD, insomnia, it's worth looking at histamine for these conditions as well. And we know that histamine, calming histamine down in the brain, calms down what's going on in terms of our nervous system and our emotions, because if you suffer from insomnia, walk into a pharmacy and buy something over the counter, chances are you're going to get an antihistamine. And that's what Nitol is. It's an antihistamine. The reason we take antihistamines to help us sleep is that it dulls down histamine levels and it keeps us nice and calm. So as I say, missing links, so much to look at. So mental health, physical health, you know, it all joins up together, and histamine is a key issue in amongst it all.
So fantastic. Thank you for sharing all of that with us today. And people can find a histamine diet online if they just Google it. I think there's plenty of that around for people to look for. But they can also find out a little bit of information on your website, healthfoodandmore.co.uk.
Yeah, and the other thing that we're now doing, I always used to just do face-to-face consultations because that's how we always traditionally operated. But herbal medicine's gone online, and so all the medical herbalists up and down the country, it would seem, are now embracing Zoom consultations, including myself. So whereas before I would just be working with people locally, I'm having people contact me from all over the country to look at getting support online from Zoom, so, or not from Zoom, but on Zoom. And you know, there is that opportunity. If you felt that you were struggling to unpack all of this, then it's worthwhile working with a practitioner. Either you know, contact a local medical herbalist or a local nutritionist, or you can get in touch and we can do something over the internet. But you know, it is a massive subject. There is loads of information out there. Sometimes the role of a therapist is to actually, as I say, try and unpack that a little bit, because the amount of information out there can be overwhelming, and it's really hard to get that insight into what's going on yourself. You sometimes need a little bit of help with that.
Oh, totally. I absolutely agree with you on that. Yeah, definitely. And then if people want to have a consultation with you, they can give you a call.
Yeah, give us a call and we can have a chat. Yeah, and we're always happy to give advice over the phone as well. If somebody's looking for some particular help or a particular supplement, then yeah, just get in touch.